tradition in the Jewish faith, and also how our mind creates memories and recreates them, perhaps in a way that's more pleasant or more miserable. We'll find out. We welcome Dr. Scott Hinze, Assistant Professor of Psychology, and he'll go first, and then following him will be Dr. Eric Mazur, who is the Gloria and David Furman Professor of Judaic Studies and a fellow in the Center for the Study of Religious Freedom. And I'm sure he would come up with an extra title if we could just fit it on the line. That'd be great. But they come from two different perspectives, and it will be up to you to figure out the relationship between these two things we talked about today. I hope you enjoy it. Our next one will be later in the month, and then we'll be looking at the journey of Jesus and the family trip to Disney World. So, think about that. All right, welcome, Dr. Hinze. Yay.
Okay, thank you. I'm from the psychology department. I'm a cognitive psychologist. So I'm interested in learning and memory and really anything mental processes going on in your head. So when I was asked to talk about journeys, I immediately thought of something that maybe not everybody else does, but I thought about mental journeys and how our thoughts and our memories change over time and change with us as we go through different points of our lives. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is kind of a metaphorical mental journey. And so let's start with some common ground. I think we can all agree that memory is not complete and perfect. We don't have a pensieve like Dumbledore that we can still store all of our memories. We don't have a videotape of everything that happens. I think we all agree to that. But oftentimes when we think about our memories being incomplete, we think about memory over time as eroding or fading. And we think about memory as something that we had in the past, so we had a memory and it was solid, and then over time it becomes less solid, it becomes something that we can't access anymore, it fades away or erodes. This isn't a terrible metaphor, but it's not really how cognitive psychologists think about memory. We think about memory as something much more dynamic, much more of a reconstructive process that we're sort of consistently working on throughout our lives and changing. So I like to think of it a little bit more like storytelling or a little bit more like a performance. And every time you tell a story, you're going to tell it slightly different. You're going to tell it slightly differently depending on the audience, depending on your surroundings, depending on how you feel that day. And each time you tell it, you're going to refine it and change it just a little bit. Same thing with the performance. Each time somebody performs the 39 steps, they do it slightly differently, depending on who's directing, who's acting, the situation, and the audience. And all these other factors go into it. I think our memories are a lot like this. As opposed to being something from the past that we just lose over time, there's something that we repeatedly perform and tell stories from and change as we go. So I'm going to talk about some research that deals with this reconstructive process where we build our memories up over and over again. One point I want to make is that our memories travel and change with us depending on the context that we're in. So a lot of you would have experienced this if you ever go back and visit your high school or your middle school. You might notice that memories just sort of start popping up of things from high school. They might be good things or bad things. For some of us, this is my high school in Shelby, Michigan. Middle of nowhere. This is the only thing there. There's nothing else to the right or to the left. That's my high school, and when I visit, things from high school start to pop up, and they're things that wouldn't come to mind when I'm sitting here in Virginia Beach. So we all kind of have this experience that our context matters. Psychologists have studied this for years and have shown that when we move to different contexts, what we remember and what we don't remember tends to change. So a classic study from the 1970s had participants learn a series of words either while scuba diving or while up on a boat, and then they switched contexts. So if you were scuba diving, you got up on the boat. If you're on the boat, you go scuba diving. And it turned out when people were scuba diving, they could remember words they learned while scuba diving. When they're on the boat, they could remember words they learned while on the boat. but not so much vice versa. Okay? So people were using the context they were in to reconstruct their memories, and that was changing what they could remember and what they couldn't. More recently, Gabe Radvansky and colleagues at Notre Dame found that the simple act of walking through a doorway can cause forgetting. So if you walk 15 feet across a room, you tend to remember the things that you just learned. If you walk through a doorway, you tend to forget some of those things. So just the simple context change of leaving a room can change what we remember and what we don't remember.
So we should all stay here the rest of the day?
Yeah, don't. And when you leave, some of you will forget what I just said. So this context, the location you're in, can change what you remember and what you don't. But it's not just the location. There are other things that can change, and those things can change what we remember and don't. So for instance, memory seems to be mood congruent. If you're in a positive mood, you tend to remember more positive things. If you're in a negative mood, you tend to remember more negative things. And some people say that this is a partial explanation for why things like anxiety and depression are self-perpetuating, right? So when you're feeling down, you tend to remember negative things, and that perpetuates a cycle of depression. Well, if we have some way to change our mood, to think about the world a little differently through therapy or pharmaceuticals or just changes in lifestyle, exercise, we might not only feel better right now, but also focus on more positive memories. On the right, I've got two individuals here who've undergone some change. We could probably refer to them as younger and older, or we could refer to them as maybe somebody new to a job and an expert. Okay. Actually, either way, those two changes affect the way that we remember things. So when you get older and when you become an expert in your field, what tends to happen is we tend to focus a little bit less on the specific details of memories. We're very good at that when we're young. We focus on details and can remember specifics. When we get older, we tend to back up a little bit and think about themes, think about the big picture, and think about overarching ideas. One approach is not really better than the other one, but as I get older, I think the second one is better. And so when you gain expertise and when you get older, we tend to remember different things about our experiences. We tend to remember more of the gist of the big picture. So these changes can occur not just in the location we're in, but also within ourselves. This reconstructive idea of memory, the idea that we bring up our memories and reconstruct them and can change them based on our context and our current feelings, is that actually has a lot of implications. And psychologists have identified this. There's actually a chemical process that's involved in it. So I won't get into it in too much detail because this is a sacred music lecture, but what we've identified is that when you learn something new, there's actually a chemical process in your hippocampus where called consolidation, where we store a new memory. What's interesting is this same chemical process occurs when we retrieve a memory. So the chemical process that occurs to store a new memory is the same one that occurs when we retrieve a new memory. And it turns out when you retrieve a new memory, you can modify it. So researchers do this with chemicals sometimes, but I'll talk about some ways we can do it without injecting chemicals. Right? So when you retrieve an old memory, it's essentially a chance to relearn, to modify your old memories, and to change our minds. There's just more evidence of that. There's a few implications of this. I'm going to talk about three. One of them comes from some of my work and some others, is that when we reconstruct our memories, we have a chance to reorganize them, to refine them, to make them just a little bit better. Okay? So like every time you tell a story, that story gets a little bit more fluid. Our memories do the same kind of thing. Okay? So here's a study of mine. We had 3 groups of people. They all read some texts about biology topics, and then 7 days later they took a test. So everyone's doing the same thing. One group just reread the text like they would normally to study. We had one group retrieve the text from memory, so they bring it up from memory and they reconstruct it, but we don't ask them to do anything else. Okay, so just retrieve it from memory. A third group, we had them retrieve it from memory, but then had them try to reorganize it, change it, and make it more organized into an explanation. Okay? And the idea is that you have to bring up your memories from the past. That gives you an opportunity to change, and then if you reorganize it, then your memories are going to be different later on. And what we found was that the group who was asked to retrieve their memories and explain it and reorganize it did better on the test. It was a very hard test. They did better on the test a week later than folks who didn't reorganize their memories. So this is one way we can change our memories. Another one is that we have a chance to correct misconceptions. So a lot of psychology researchers deal with misconceptions in physics and in other domains. And a lot of people have this misconception in physics that when you shoot a ball through a tube like this, there's going to be some impetus force where the curve of the tube is going to keep the ball coming out at a curve. Right? How many of you think that might be right? I used to think that's right. Okay. It's actually not. It turns out that there is no impetus force. It doesn't continue in a curvilinear fashion. It'll come out at the same angle it's traveling at the end of the tube. It'll keep going at the same angle. It won't keep curving. So it turns out that one way to get people to learn the correct conception here is to have them retrieve the misconception first. And this is a little counterintuitive because you think, well, that'll be confusing if they retrieve the wrong thing. Why don't you just tell them the accurate thing? But it works in terms of reconstruction. So you retrieve your old memory, you make it changeable and malleable, you start that process over again, and now when I tell you the correct information, you can change your memory. Okay? So it's not just that you learned a new thing, you've actually changed your old memories as well. Another potential implication of restructuring and reconstruction is maybe explaining why some therapeutic interventions work as well as they do. For example, one treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder involves virtual reality exposure therapy, where a client will get in a virtual reality simulator and they try to replicate a war zone as much as possible. Sometimes they even pump in smells and air in order to replicate the context as much as possible. But they do it in an environment that the client knows is safe, right? And so they're retrieving an old memory, but they're doing it in a new, safe context, right? And so the idea is maybe they can change their memories of the traumatic experiences through this reconstruction process. So that was a lot of things I threw at you. I want to take you back a little bit to the theme here of the journey. I think I have 3 points to make about the journey and memory. The first point is that our memories travel with us and they change with us. So they're not just some record of the past. When we go on a journey, when we go to a new place, when we think about new things, when we grow up and change, our memories are things that we're going to reconstruct in our new context. They change with us. The other point I want to make is that our thoughts, our feelings, our choices, who we decide to surround ourselves with, where we decide to live, those are going to have effects on your future outcomes, but they also affect the way that we reminisce about our past. So we reconstruct our past based on our current situation. And I think that's a hopeful thing for a lot of people who maybe want to think about their past a little bit differently. And the last point I want to make is that I think this reconstruction idea is a pretty important one. I think it's kind of fundamental to how our minds work. And it has some implications for education and for therapy. But also maybe as kind of a model for how change works in general. If you want to change your memory, or maybe other things, it helps first to reconstruct that memory, to bring it up to the foreground, and that gives you a chance to make some changes to it and to make something happen. So I think that's kind of a nice model for change. And that's all.
We'll have time for a few questions at the end, after Dr. Mazur speaks. Yeah, so don't leave, don't walk out the door.
Okay. Yes, I will.
We often find in the world of music that memory comes with the tune and more than the text. And so oftentimes, particularly in sacred music, we find that people bring back the memories of the places they were. You remember a funeral where this was sung, or a wedding where you heard that particular song, and all of that floods back those memories. Join me in welcoming Dr.
The weird thing about a little bit of knowledge, particularly medical knowledge or scientific knowledge, is that you then see yourself in all it. So as Dr. Hinze was talking, I was thinking, oh yeah, that's me. Oh yeah, that's me too. And as a matter of fact, September ended rather abruptly for me. And so it was only like Tuesday that I realized I was doing this today. So I'm one of those old, big picture, but the details seem to get lost. One detail that I had to do something physical to remind myself. Any of my students who are here, make sure you sign so I know you were here and you get the proper adulation and credit. When I first saw your presentation at the beginning, I thought that the names were photo credits on your PowerPoint. So I want to provide a disclaimer. All of my photos have been stolen, and they are entirely unattributed. But I figure educational use is a good exception. Now, let me see. Okay, I'm Aramean. In 1972, my parents took me and my sisters on a trip to Israel and England, and it was the first time I realized that I had my own passport. I was given my passport with a picture of 7-year-old me, and I didn't think anything of it at the time. But years later, I came to understand why I had my own passport. My mom, I used to, jokingly refer to her as a bleeding heart liberal. But my dad, I often joke, was the last socialist in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Part of it had to do with the fact that in 1972, when Richard Nixon was reelected, they were convinced that there was danger on the horizon. And so my sisters and I were all given individual passports in case we needed to flee the country. Part of this was their view of politics. It's ironic, but for my dad, the last socialist in the Commonwealth, every subsequent Republican election proved him right, but wrong about the previous election. He kept thinking, oh, this one's going to be worse, and this one's going to be worse, and now we're really going to have to go, things like that. So Nixon was fine in comparison to later Republicans, according to his view. But they were convinced that we we might have to flee the country. Also what was going on in Vietnam and things there. But part of this was also informed by their Jewishness, not so much theology, but history. And so I'm going to go through a little bit of that in a moment. As it turned out, it's kind of like people who predict the end of the world from storms or tragedies. You never go wrong predicting that there's going to be anti-Semitism. Just a few years, actually, as it turned out, while we were in England, PLO terrorists invaded the Olympic Village in Munich, Germany, and killed 11 Israeli athletes. And within 3 years, the UN had declared Zionism, the Jewish longing for a homeland, to be the equivalent of racism, the only liberation struggle so identified by the UN. So there's a history and a contemporary presence that has informed Jewish notions of the need for flight. And this gives us, and I'm speaking personally here because I'm caught up in this as well. I still have an individual passport, but I don't know how many 7-year-olds have an individual passport or for the reasons. But Jews have, in the last 2,000 years, come to understand the world in a particular way. So I'm going to explore that in a moment. There are two stages of the notion of pilgrimage in Judaism. One is derived from the biblical period, which I would describe not only as that described in the 5 books of Moses, the Chumash, but also in the other materials identified by Christians as the Old Testament, but by Jews as the Tanakh, the prophets, and the other canonical writings. And then there's the post-biblical period, which begins roughly in the 1st century, the Common Era. During the biblical period, Jews went from a nomadic people to a more settled culture, and some of the pilgrimage sites represent that notion of pilgrimage. The cave of Machpelah in in Hebron is where the patriarchs were reported to have been buried: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and a few, but not all of their wives. And that continues to be a pilgrimage site for some, although given the location on the West Bank, that has often been a very dangerous and contested pilgrimage. Another pilgrimage site is Rachel's tomb. She's one of the matriarchs who is not buried in Machpelah. That's at Bethlehem, another location on the West Bank, which has made pilgrimage to that location kind of problematic. But once the Hebrews settle, the main place of identity and therefore pilgrimage as the community grows will be the Holy Temple constructed first by Solomon in Jerusalem. The first temple really represented more of a state symbol. It was sort of the king's official symbol of the state, and it wasn't used as a people's gathering place initially, not like Christians come to understand it during the life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. The Babylonians will destroy it in 586 before the Common Era and send the Jews into exile. This is the setting for the 137th Psalm, where there's a remembrance of the temple and of Jerusalem as a lost, not just as a lost building for worship, it really wasn't used as a building for worship in the same way, but as a lost identity. This is the beginning of a notion of messianic longing for Jews because they have been taken out of their state, their autonomy has been destroyed, they've been dispersed through the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian exile will only last about 50 years, but it's such a jarring event that it gives rise to the notions of the Messiah that will continue to be important in Judaism, but will also have a profound effect in Christianity and Islam. At the end of the 50-year period, the Babylonians are defeated by the Persians, and so the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Persian king lets the Hebrews go back to Jerusalem and provides them with some materials to rebuild the temple. The second temple, that becomes the place of more popular usage and becomes the place of pilgrimage. Now you have Jews living throughout what had been the Babylonian Empire. Some remained in what is at the time considered Persia or today Iran. But there was an expectation that they would make a pilgrimage to the Holy Temple 3 times a year. One is the current period, what Jews consider to be the real holiday season of Rosh Hashanah, which just passed, Yom Kippur, which starts tomorrow night, and Sukkot. The holiday of Pesach, known in English as Passover, which is in the spring, early spring, and then the holiday of Shavuot, which is in the late spring. These were the harvest holidays. Israel has a 3-season cycle in a year, kind of like California, which is why so many Israelis live in Southern California. And so you were expected to bring the first fruits of the harvest to the temple to thank God, and also to lubricate the priestly mechanism that was centered there. Eventually, that cycle of harvest holidays will also be superimposed with the exile or the Exodus narrative of Moses bringing the Hebrews out of Egypt and the wanderings through the wilderness. These 3 holidays are known not only as Yom Tov, good days, but really the best of days, the holy days. but also in English are known as holidays of the feet, because you were expected to make the pilgrimage. There were no trains, planes, or automobiles. You were expected to make your way to Jerusalem. The Romans, of course, the conquest in the years 66 through 73, and then in really the massive destruction of the Jewish community there in the 130s of the Common Era will end the Second Temple period and begin a much more profound notion of exile in Judaism. What in Judaism, what in Hebrew is known as galut, which means a separation, an exile. And it's understood as a physical removal. The Jews, particularly after the Jewish wars in the 130s, are really dispersed throughout the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire being the world to those people at that time, from England to the Mediterranean and North Africa, and then as far east as Persia. The Jewish notion of being in the world changes. They are no longer have access to God's house in Jerusalem and are at a distance from God. So there's this physical exile, but there's also a spiritual exile from God. I really recommend Stephen Prothero's God is Not One. It's a book about 7 of the world's religions, but he makes the argument that they're not all the same and that they seek to answer, they privilege one question that they seek to answer, and they answer it differently. The one question is, what's your primary focus? And he argues that in Islam it's hubris, right? The notion that you think you can do anything without God is considered a false belief in Islam. In Christianity, it's a question of sin. How do you overcome the fallen nature of humanity? But in Judaism, it's distance from the divine, distance from God. And that comes about in this period of galut, this period of exile, because of the distance from not only the spiritual home of God, but the spiritual connection to God is seen as attenuated. It's made even more difficult by the construction of 2 mosques actually on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, built by the Muslim Empire in the 7th century. Jerusalem will be itself sectioned off. Obviously, quarter has nothing to do with geographic or geometric size. But Jerusalem today, the old city of Jerusalem, is still organized this way. And so you can visit the Jewish quarter, the Aramean quarter, the Christian quarter, or the Muslim quarter. You can see where the Jewish quarter is. This is now the mount where the 2 mosques are located. And because of that, access to the top will be limited. The temple is destroyed and replaced by the mosque. All that remains as a holy site for Jews, and what comes to be known as the Wailing Wall. Here it's known as the Western Wall, I'll explain that in a moment. But the Wailing Wall is this portion right here. It's not even a wall of the temple, it's a wall of the mount, the pedestal on which the temple had been built. It's a very limited access. Elsewhere in the world, things were going not particularly well for the Jews, obviously. Expulsions in France starting in 1182, and then moving on to England and Germany and Spain, and another one in Germany, and Spain and Portugal. Will expel the Jews from those areas across Europe. Segregations will also force Jews to live in very specific areas. The word ghetto is the name of the section in Venice, Italy, where the Jews were forced to live. We think of ghetto in socioeconomic terms, but it was a religious, cultural religious segregation. And that's common throughout the world centuries before the Germans will do something like this to the Jews during World War II. There, of course, is the Spanish Inquisition. It sometimes surprises people to realize how long no one expects the Spanish Inquisition. No one expects the Spanish Inquisition to have lasted 350 years. That's its official end date. Of course, in that year, someone was put to death. But the Spanish Inquisition includes not only Spain, but the Spanish Empire, which includes Mexico as well. And Jews were tortured and put to death in Mexico as well as in Spain for still practicing Judaism. There will be issues of forced conversions. This is Edgardo Mortera, an Italian 6-year-old Jewish child who was secretly baptized by his nanny and then kidnapped because as a Christian he could no longer live with Jewish parents. He would eventually become a priest, but it was a real point of tension between the Vatican, the emerging New Italy that was to come about, and the United States. And then, of course, there's just a general sense of unease and violence. Leo Frank, shop manager in Atlanta, was lynched by a mob in 1915. And of course, since we're entering the 20th century, there's the Jewish encounter with Nazi Germany, period of migration from 33 to 38, Jews being forced to leave a place that they had considered home for over 1,000 years because of Nazi Germany. It stops in 1938, not because the war begins, but because they are no longer permitted to leave. Some do escape. This is the steamship Hinze, a Portuguese-flagged ship that's chartered by Jews in Europe to bring some refugees to the United States. Some get off in New York, including this gentleman right here, Marcel Dalio. Anybody recognize that scene? It's a classic scene in Casablanca where after the police commissioner tells Rick Blaine he's got to close, that he's shocked to hear that there's gambling going on at Rick's Cafe. Dalio comes up and offers him his winnings. He was on the boat, he got off in New York, but the vast majority of the people on the boat were not permitted to leave. They went down to Mexico, where the boat was refused. It stopped in Norfolk, here at Sewell's Point, on its way back to Europe to refuel. A local admiralty law expert, an attorney in Newport News, sued the company, had it held up long enough to get the State Department and Eleanor Roosevelt involved and got the rest of the people off. More people are familiar with the St. Louis, the so-called Voyage of the Damned, which didn't have as much luck, in part because of the Kwanzaa experience. Breckinridge Long, Undersecretary of State, really closed the door on Jewish refugees. There's some indication that FDR may have been a little anxious about what he considered to be a fifth column, people coming from Europe, coming into the United States as refugees, but actually forming some sort of subversive underground. And of course, this is what happened to people left behind. So it's no wonder that in the post-World War II era, the main places of Jewish pilgrimage are not to reconnect with the divine. That connection is still broken. It's to connect with those lost. So Auschwitz, Poland is still, it's considered holy but not sacred. It's holy in that it is a place where God was not in some ways. Yad Vashem is the Israel Holocaust Memorial Museum. That's become a significant spot of pilgrimage, not only for Jews, but for many visiting politicians. It's where visiting politicians and heads of state will go to lay a wreath or whatever. This one's particularly, I can only think of a word a friend of mine uses, oogie, because Pope Benedict had himself been a member of Hitler's youth as a child. But there it is, laying the wreath of Yad Vashem at the memorial, Central Memorial. And of course, in the United States, the Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C., which is not only a well-visited museum, but it in many ways is considered a pilgrimage site for many Jews who feel the need to go and go back. There are happier sites of pilgrimage in the United States, old synagogues, mostly in the Northeast, mostly in New York, but also sites of just enjoyable Jewish culture, Katz's Deli, Carnegie Deli, among them. In 1967, after Israel was attacked from all sides by their Arab neighbors, the country doubled in size because the Israelis were able to push back the aggressors in what was called the Six-Day War. And important sites in Jewish history were then put under Israeli control. One, probably the most profound, is Masada, which had been a holdout in the Roman conquest. A group of Jews took over an abandoned Roman outpost, well stocked, and they stocked it with food, and they loaded the cisterns with water. This is what in the American Southwest you would call a butte, right? It's sort of a flattened top of a mountain. The Romans couldn't get up the winding snake paths because you could just roll a pebble, and by the time it reached them, it was a landslide, a rock slide. So they spent quite some time, and this is depicted in a very bad movie with Richard Gere, right? Doesn't he play that Masada film? It's a stinker of a film, but you take what you get. But anyway, the Romans built a wall, a ramp out of dirt, and lost many soldiers in the process. They finally get to the top, and according to legend anyway, because he wasn't there, Josephus writes that all of the people on the top committed suicide rather than be taken prisoner by the Romans. Did they actually commit suicide? He wasn't there. But certainly enough of them committed suicide, some of them murdered others. It's unclear, but they're all dead by the time the Romans got to the top. This is considered a significant site in Jewish nationalist history, so much so that members of the Israeli Defense Force, IDF, are inducted at the top after climbing the mountain and coming all the way from Jerusalem on a 15-mile hike to get there, and make a vow that something like this will never happen again. Of course, in the background, it's not only the Roman conquest, but Nazi Germany that's in their memories. But the most important pilgrimage site in Judaism since 1967 has been the wall of the Temple Mount. No longer called by many the Wailing Wall, it is now simply known as the Western Wall. This marks the end of, for many, of physical separation, but it doesn't really end the notion of the spiritual exile. But the conditions are such, well, the truth is, the conditions are such that that spiritual exile can never end, because a third temple would have to be built, which would involve destroying the two mosques on the Temple Mount. That will never happen, certainly not peaceably. But at least now Jerusalem is under Jewish control. So according to those for whom this is an element of their theology, the location where the precursor to the Messiah, Elijah, can come through the gate, the proper gate, it's now under Jewish control, and the Temple Mount, at least, is in Jewish territory. And so at least there's a hope if there's not an end to spiritual exile. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. Do you have any? I have one. Can I start? So would it not be believed that if Jews did not control that spot, Elijah could not come, or is that just so pleasant, but that there would be someone to meet him that he'd recognize?
I think it would have less to do with him recognizing anybody and more to do with people recognizing him. I don't think the two are necessarily compatible. I think that Jews would just feel more comfortable if it were under Jewish control. But the real kicker there is the temple can't be built. The temple would have to be built before the Messiah could come through the gate, or the precursor.
Another question?
What was?
Question for Dr. Hinze. So for an educational standpoint, for the memory thing, is it better for I feel like, is it better to teach students to try and explain what you've taught them rather than just have them reread and just repeat what the book tells them? Because the grade increased drastically, almost 20%.
Yeah. Yes. So yeah, just rereading your notes is not a particularly effective strategy. I think the bigger lesson is sort of bringing up what it is that you learned in the past and then doing something with it, elaborating on it in some way, and combining those two things is really powerful. So retrieve it from memory, then do something with it to make it change.
So lecture your hallmates or something?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, teaching others is a really good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have another question. But, okay, you know in like high school, you learn in a classroom, but then when you take like, what's it called?
SAT?
SOL, yeah, sorry. They put you in another room. Wouldn't that cause you to like not recall memory better? Should you take the tests in the classrooms that you learn them in?
A little bit, yeah. It affects performance a little bit, but I think one way to think about it is that you want your memories to. There are ways to make your memories a little less context dependent, right? So if you just learned it in the classroom and that's the only time you've ever experienced it, and you leave, you might lose it. But if you study in multiple different contexts, then it's more generalizable. So that's why I study.
And Crystal, you had a question earlier?
Yeah, just the reference to the book about the different views of God. What was the author?
God is not one.
Stephen Prothero, Prothero. God is not one.
How did you decide who you were going to use as your subject to test for the biology study, to retain the information?
Well, we used psychology students in intro to psychology because they were available, and we could force them to participate. But we also then used some biology folks as well to see if people had some basis of knowledge, would that change it? And it did a little bit. So if you have the knowledge already, you can sort of use different strategies.
Were they about like your age?
They were college students.
College students. I think it would be super interesting to study it across a social diverse population, because did you have them all just read the text?
Mm-hmm.
So like if you were to take people from different generations and then even have like an audio visual learning situation versus just reading, because I think even in a younger generation, the way that we retain memory is so different than maybe the older generation would. And because of everything that we're exposed to media-wise and stuff.
Right, yeah, so if you did a multimedia presentation or something, then maybe people would be better at it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Dr. Mazur, to what extent does the journey narratives, the wilderness narratives in the Tanakh support and underwrite the Jewish journey now? Is that a strong emphasis and source of both guidance and comfort, or is it?
Well, liturgically, it's absolutely foundational.
Right.
The central narrative in Judaism is the enslavement and the freedom, or the liberation from slavery. And it's worked into the liturgical cycle. So Passover is the moment of liberation. Sukkot, this is not the temporal order, but
Right.
Passover is liberation. Sukkot is the wandering in the wilderness, and Shavuot is the revelation of text at Sinai. Did those events actually occur? Believers believe they did. Non-believers, historians, archaeologists would say, no, there's not a whole lot of evidence. But the historian would say it doesn't matter because they're superimposed on a pre-existing cycle of pilgrimage to the Holy Temple, so it just becomes the same thing. The exile, the Babylonian exile, is really seen as the way of understanding Jewish existence in the world since the revelation of Torah, because Nebuchadnezzar is seen as the Babylonian king, is seen, well, I figure I'm just explaining, is seen as the tool of the divine to punish the Hebrews who had not been doing things correctly, which is a way of justifying doing everything after as the correct way of doing it. The Roman exile, I wouldn't say that the Romans involved. That image is the Arch of Titus, right? So that's the image of the Romans coming back, the soldiers coming back to Rome with the loot of the Holy Temple to celebrate that's in Rome. that's seen as fitting into the same thing, only in a much longer term as the Babylonian exile. That interpretation runs into real problems with the Holocaust, because it's hard to see Hitler as a tool of divine behavior in the world because of the numbers and the people involved. You know, 1 million children, 6 million Jews, 9 million people. That's a real horrible, you know, any sentence that begins, you know, Hitler is the tool of the divine because it's just going to end badly. You can't finish that sentence well. Which is why in post-World War II Judaism, there are a lot of Jews who can't believe in a God. But the narrative of slavery and liberation, I think, is part of the liturgical cycle, but it's much harder to believe that narrative than the exile narrative of Babylonian exile for contemporary Jews. But it means that Jews often feel like outsiders. And there's a great short story, I forget the author, maybe Nathan Englander. But the short story is called What We Talk About When We Talk About Anne Frank. And it's a fictional short story about Jews sitting down, a couple of Israelis and a couple from the United States. Basically, they start playing a game. Which of your neighbors could you trust if it happened again? And that's all about the Holocaust. And I think all Jews who think about that, the Holocaust, somewhere in their lives, they're going to look around and go, okay, this, you know, I can't trust this neighbor, you know, they'll turn me in, you know, something like that. And so that forces a distance from everybody in the county.
And memories fly apart. We have no more time. Thank you very much for coming. Would you, thank our We hope to see you next time, and you will make your journey back from Hinze.